Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Haberman Institute's first in a 3-lecture seminar series on Islam in the Middle East, presented by Professor Paul Liptz, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. I'm Elaine Amir, President of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies Board of Directors. And for those of you who are new or who may not recall, our mission is to provide high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. Today's lecture will surely fulfill our mission. Beyond this lecture, the Haberman Institute is offering additional summer programs online for the first time. We have a number of ongoing classes, another seminar series, and several cultural events already scheduled. Please visit our website, habermaninstitute.org, and join us on Facebook to be in the know as we announce new offerings. Special thanks today to Temple Beth Ami for co-sponsoring this lecture. We have enjoyed many events in Beth Ami's beautiful facility in Rockville, and I hope that we'll all gather there again in the near future. Over the next 45 minutes or so, Professor Liptz will speak, followed by a question and answer period moderated by our Executive Director, Matthew Silverman. If you have questions during the program, please enter them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, please bear with us if we hit any technical glitches. Rest assured, if the tech doesn't hold up as planned, we're recording this lecture and we'll share it with you as quickly as we can. And now it's my pleasure to tell you about our speaker. Professor Paul Liptz is a social historian. He is Director of Education at the Anita Saltz International Education Center, World Union for Progressive Judaism in Jerusalem. Prior to his current position, he was on the faculty of Tel Aviv University for 40 years, teaching graduate and undergraduate students in the Department of Middle East and African History. He has also taught at Jerusalem campus of the Hebrew Union College, dealing with modern Jewish history, Israeli history, and the Middle East. His main interests are pre-state Israel, the modern state of Israel, Arab women, and nationalism in the Middle East. Professor Liptz has a BA in History and Philosophy from the University of Rhodesia, a branch of London University, and an MA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Asian and African Studies. He was born in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and came as a volunteer to Israel one day before the Six-Day War in 1967. He decided to stay in Israel, where he studied and taught at the Hebrew University before joining the faculty at Tel Aviv University. He has spent decades traveling the world extensively, lecturing and conducting workshops in some 20 countries. He has also lectured to many American groups touring Central and Eastern Europe. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Liptz, who has been waiting patiently from his home in Jerusalem. Professor Liptz, the screen is yours.
Start your video. You don't want to share your screen?
Yes. Good morning. I hope you can all see me and hear me. At the moment, I can't see, I can see my own screen, but not anyone else. So we'll just see what we can correct there. Okay, fine. So hopefully you can all see me okay. Just a few words about my session and about myself. It was mentioned that I taught a class many years ago at Tel Aviv University on women in Arab society. And that really intrigued me. It was a sociologically based course, but very, very quickly I found it necessary to become involved with the Islamic side. And so what I'll be doing with you is what happened to me many years ago, and the outline that you got on me was an earlier one. Things have happened since then. But I'd be very happy if any of you contact me by email. As you see as we go through for the next 45 minutes, that my email address appears at the bottom, and you're more than welcome to come in and write to me at any time you want. Now, the 3 sessions are going to deal with, firstly, we'll deal with Saudi Arabia. Essentially, it's a 101 on Islam, Saudi Arabia being the center, but we'll move up to the later periods as well. The second session will be on Iran-based, and we'll look at the Shia group. And the third session will be a case study on Turkey. So let's start off, and let me try and make some general comments about religion, and certainly religion in the Middle East. When I'm in the United States, and I've been to your lovely country on probably 25 occasions, I'm always struck how very different the religion or concepts of religion are looked at. When we speak about religion in the Middle East, we're speaking about something which is essentially a complex combination of politics and economics and land and the status of women and all those kind of issues. Unfortunately, religion in the Middle East is not dialogue based. And as I say, when I'm in the United States and I've been involved in various dialogue frameworks with Muslim and Christian leaders, religious leaders, I'm always struck how very, very different it is. So I think you'll be hearing things during the next 3 sessions which are going to be different from what many of you have probably experienced in the United States, but I'm sure at the same time you will be aware of exactly how the Middle East functions. So let's just start off now, and as you heard earlier, you're welcome to forward any questions that I'll try and deal with in about 40 minutes time. So let's start off with the basic and most important issue, and that's the Quran. The Quran is different from Tanakh, different from the Bible, because in Islam, you don't really have Mishnah and Talmud. Now, I'm not saying you don't have analysis and commentary over the centuries, because you certainly do. But in a different kind of way, Quran is so central, it is so basic, that in many, many Islamic societies, being a well-versed Muslim would actually be to know the whole of the Quran off by heart. And that's very indicative, by the way. It means that knowing it off by heart is the way of feeling it. Now, the commentaries which do exist in Islam don't have the same kind of theological weight as Talmud has. So I think that's an important issue. And therefore, when we speak about Islam, and we're speaking about Islam very much from the Middle Eastern perspective, obviously Muslims find themselves in a vast part of the world, something in the region of 1.7 billion. It's a massive figure of people are Muslims, but the Islam of the Middle East is the most intense. It's the most intense because, as you'll see as we go through, much of early Islam is actually based in the Middle East. Mecca and Medina are the foci. So what does the Quran really consist of? And for any of you who haven't yet looked at the Quran and want to read it, I think you'll find it quite difficult initially. And the reason is the Quran has no chronological basis to it. You don't really know where you are in terms of time. The Quran is essentially, except for 1 or 2 small exceptions, based on the longest surah, the longest chapter at the beginning, going down to the very shortest one, all in all 114 chapters. And I think what was difficult, and I remember the very first time that I looked at the Quran and read it, I remember I found it difficult to know what was actually going on. But over a bit of time, you sort of get the hang of it. The Quran is based on 23 years in all. And what has caused controversy within the world of Islam is the fact that Muhammad was considered to be illiterate, and he probably was. He came from a fairly rural, basic kind of background. And after he died in 1632, people who had been his companions started writing down the information. We'll talk a little bit later about Muhammad and exactly how he comes within the story of the Quran. The Quran is essentially a combination of phenomenon. And it's interesting source because on the one hand, Allah, the Almighty, speaks to the Prophet Gabriel. Sometimes Muhammad, the Prophet, the last and greatest of the prophets, and we must emphasize that because that's important from a Judaic perspective as well. But the angel Gabriel is the intermediary in many senses between the Almighty Allah and Muhammad, who then in the Quran itself, and this is what's so interesting about the Quran, in the Quran itself, Muhammad is alive and active. And so on the one hand, it's a kind of very theological source. And on the other hand, it's a kind of historical, almost folklorish kind of source, which certainly makes for interesting reading. A lot of Quran is mundane, day-to-day kind of activities. You can see there's 6,200 verses. Only a relatively small amount of them would be put into what we might call theology. But there is a very strong component of justice, kindness, and charity. That's certainly true. So when a Muslim would say to one, we live by the words of the Quran, you can certainly pick up in the Quran a very, very humane perspective. But as we know from pretty much all religious sources, that religion in various situations moved away from justice, kindness, and charity into what I would say is very important in terms of understanding what religion is in many parts of the world, certainly not all, and that is a survival concept. How do you survive in any world when you have competing nationalisms and competing ideologies? And the exact same issue we find ourselves in what we'll be talking about, the challenge of trying to understand how one brings the purity of theology and put it at the same table, so to speak, with the complexity of politics and economics. So that's really where some of the issues come up. We'll be looking a little later at some of the war verses. Some of the Quran's relation to conflict are very much in restraining language, trying to make sure that the world, which was a world of chaos, the world before Islam in Saudi Arabia was an awful kind of world. And so compared with what had existed before, what Muhammad brought into it and what the Quran brings into it is very, very advanced. It's an improved kind of environment. We're talking obviously about many centuries ago. So what do we know about the Prophet? There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. This, in a sense, has major importance for both Judaism and Christianity. There is, as we'll see, and I'm sure many of you know, Islam has done something which is quite remarkable and has been very successful. It has taken significant sections of Judaism and Christianity and included it into Islam, both in terms of theology and in terms of territory. That's why it's very sensible, if you look at it as a strategic planner, not necessarily as a theologian, it's very important to have a hierarchy of places, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. So the inclusion of Jerusalem, so the modern analysis, the person looking at it from an analytical perspective would say, well, that's really sensible. It means if you want to bring the first of the three religions in this area into your central concept, well, include Jerusalem as well. How do we define the prophet? Religious, social, political leader, and certainly the founder of Islam. The prophet's life is complex, and what we ask ourselves in terms of his background, how did he or Allah through through Gabriel, the angel, know as much as they did about Judaism and Christianity? And that's a big question, but part of what they did know about Judaism obviously comes from the three tribes who existed at that time in Saudi Arabia. What was his life all about? Just to take a few of the components that you see on the slide there. He was an orphan. He grew up in a tough kind of environment. He orphaned quite young, living in Mecca. Now, Mecca was a central trading center. It was what we might call a religious area, but certainly of a different kind of religiosity. The pre-Islamic religiosity did exist in Mecca at the time. The Kaaba, for example, that central black stone, had a religious importance. But Muhammad is going to move religion from a kind of a tribal phenomenon to basically to give it the ability to become a worldwide religion. With his new ideas, and he had been in a cave, and there were comments that he was shaking and shivering and things like that, many different commentaries I'll be taking advantage of. And he went to the people of Mecca, and he started saying to them, this old-fashioned tribalism, this clan tensions which seem to be going on are actually no good for anyone, and they were unimpressed. Who was this relatively young person, 40 years old, who had a status by marrying a very wealthy woman? That was clever. Once again, I'm making comments which move out of theology and into a political analysis, married a wealthy woman, and this certainly helped push him ahead, but he was mocked. And I think one must say very clearly that question of honor and pride in Islam until today are very important, and certainly within the Arab world, that to humiliate someone is, it takes on a different level of pain, as we might feel if someone said something rather nasty about us. In some Islamic backgrounds, being mocked, the term I've used there, is much more problematic. He has to leave Mecca because of the issues that were going on. He moves for a fairly short period of time to Medina, and then will come back to Mecca just for the last 2 or 3 years of his life. What was his family life? And his family life has had a great impact on what happened in the Muslim world. Firstly, he had 11 wives. In Islam today, it's accepted that a man can marry 4 women. By the way, that depends on the laws of the country as well. But assuming that that is not forbidden by the legal system that they're living in, if we look at his 11 wives, they came from very different kind of backgrounds. Some of them he married because their husbands had died or been killed, and to be a woman alone would make that woman very vulnerable. There was, in fact, one of the women in the group was a Jewish woman who'd been captured, and he married her. The most interesting one of all, however, is Aisha. Aisha is the core of his life. As I mentioned earlier, I taught this course for 25 years at Tel Aviv University on women in Arab society. And Aisha was an amazing kind of figure. The Prophet married her at the age either of 6 or 9, and had sexual relations with her, as some sources say, at the age of 12. Very, very young. And what we find both from Quran and from the traditions, I'll speak about Hadith later, this young Aisha becomes a very important person. And as much as anything, she's important because she remembered all the things, 2,000 concepts or sentences or verses that her husband had used during the years, and that becomes the commentary or the traditions that are added to the Quran, which is the basic combination of what Islam is as we know it today. Military battles were central, very, very important, and without going through the nitty-gritty of each of the battles, it is a period of tremendous conflict. The Muslims start off by being much weaker, and they're a small group. The people of Mecca, the majority group of Mecca are much stronger, and there are a number of battles. Now, one has a problem of time here, but each battle has significance. And when I mentioned initially that the Quran is important almost in a sentence for sentence concept, that means that by knowing the Quran off by heart or by being very familiar with it, you can very quickly draw from it those concepts which are important to you at a particular moment of history. By the way, this is both in terms of war and in terms of peace. What does he mean? What does the Prophet Muhammad mean for us in terms of the long term? Firstly, there is a very, very strong concept in Islam of the underdog, the vulnerable, the rejected. But he succeeded. So even if you belong to one of those people in those categories, and we must remember in the periods of clan and tribal existence, if you came from a weak clan or a weak tribe, it was very hard to go through upward mobility. So here we have a situation where the symbol of the prophet, and he's spoken as the prophet, this is the last and greatest of the prophets. His background is intended to be encouraging to people, whoever they are. He understood what military force was about. He is involved, he's a military leader, but he very much tries to bring in humane aspects which come about in terms of the various treaties and ceasefire. He is buried in the green dome, which you can see in the slide there, which is in Medina. Central to Islam, and it's kind of the takeaway component of what we might say. You know, if someone would say, well, what's Islam all about? I would say that one of the best answers is to speak about the 5 pillars. Very important, very, very central, with various commentaries, which later scholars have given. The most important is there's no God but God, Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. This says very, very clearly, however much we might be interested in dialogue, and I'm certainly a great believer in compromise and peace, we have to understand that there are certain Islamic subgroups, not Islam as a whole, that's important to say, but certain Islamic subgroups who take this sentence, there's no God by God, to actually say that all others have no status in the world. Now, Islam officially has described the Jews and the Christians as the Dhimma, the second level, peoples of the book. And in discussions that I've had and in conferences that I've been involved in, I remember once at the Hebrew University conference getting involved with quite a tough argument where a Muslim person in the audience was telling me that I should be very, very grateful that I'm one of the Dhimma and not the third level, which is the heretic. And I would say, you know, I would actually prefer not to be the second level. I would be very happy to be on an equal level with other people. There's also salat, the concept of prayer, very, very clearly stated, in addition to the Judaic concept of 3 times a day, 5 times a day, and it's very clear in terms of the instructions and the positions. Alms giving, tzedakah, you know, that to be a tzaddik and to help people. Often the words are somewhat similar to in Hebrew, and tzedakah is the concept that we have here. In Islam, it's very clearly stated 2.5% of your yearly income, because it's known that in some months wouldn't have enough money. By the way, it is carefully worked out that it shouldn't be a situation that would put people in an impossible situation. So there is flexibility on it. Fasting during Ramadan, big stuff, not eating from morning to night, ending with Eid al-Fitr, which is the big ceremony. And then the concept of pilgrimage, the Hajj, where you go to the Kaaba, a whole concept by itself. Every now and again, you'll hear that jihad is considered one of the 5 pillars, and that is actually incorrect. The jihad in terms of the military jihad, we'll talk about it in a moment, is not one of the 5 pillars, but kind of very close. Hadith. Hadith is what the talk or the discourse that the Prophet was hearing. These are the Prophet's words. In the booklet that you see there, it's the Prophet's, Muhammad's legacy in the medieval and modern world. This is what he actually says. And this is when I mentioned Aisha, that was what she told. She said that her husband had said A, B, C, D, 2,300 verses or sentences, and this is why it becomes very important. Take Quran and Hadith together, that really gives you the underpinning of what Islam is. Having said that, there are disagreements and tensions because some modern Muslims, in fact, not quite a few, a fair number, are somewhat troubled by the tension between the Quran and the Prophet's talking and saying what he thought was important. Fatwa, important. Fatwas are halakha, legal concepts. You have a qualified jurist, a mufti, but by the way, there could be other positions as well, who give what is called non-binding commentary. That's why you can every now and again hear one religious leading giving one fatwa and another one giving another one. It isn't intended to be the Judaic halakha. It's intended to be an ability to deal with changing societies in various parts of the world. So that's why you have different fatwas coming out depending, and many of them are very, very down to earth, very basic stuff, how you live your basic life. Once again, as in Judaism, as in Christianity, one needs some kind of modern commentary because of the changing world. What is jihad all about? Highly misunderstood. This is really kind of one of the difficult ones. A vast number of the literature that one reads on jihad is about war, and that's often thought what it is. The origin of jihad is very different. It is about purity and struggle and striving, very much in the way of God. It's a desire for perfection. It's very important in Islam, very much a desire for perfection, but it does have within it, and this comes out of certain sections, certain surahs, certain chapters of the Quran. It can also be used against the non-Muslim in a conflict situation, but it isn't the central component. And I think one has to recognize when one hears the word in our modern societies, too often it only relates to the physical and military component. Who are the caliphs, the Khalifa? There are 4 caliphs, not having great lives, by the way. As you can see, 2 of them were assassinated, the 2nd and the 4th were assassinated. They are all people who were closely connected to Muhammad, sometimes by family and sometimes by being one of the early companions. In fact, until today, you can find Muslims around the world who can actually say, if they can't say we're physically in a family sense connected to the Prophet, they would very much say we were connected to one of the caliphs, or we were connected to one of the other companions. When they say that, they're trying to relate to a kind of a heritage, much as we would sometimes find people saying, you know, I I'm related to King David or something like that. Something on that kind of level. The importance of a family connection with past is very important. And in many Islamic sources, in trying to establish the legitimacy of a particular idea, you will see that the person would say, the writer, the historian perhaps would say, this comes from this person who is a grandchild of that person. That gives legitimacy to ideas. Islam, I think somewhat different from parts of Judaism, is tries to go back to the consistency of the Quran. That straight line, which I mentioned earlier, is very, very important. Different kind of treaties, topic by itself, but there are certain treaties in Islam which are ceasefires for 10 years, for example. There are others which are a kind of just stopping war, but not quite saying what it is. That means, just going back to the Israeli situation, the Middle East situation, when Israeli diplomats were negotiating with Yasser Arafat for what became the one big stage of Israeli-Palestinian relationship under Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, there was a question going on, what term are you actually using? And therefore they asked for the term in Arabic, because when it was said in English, it wasn't quite clear what it is. There are different levels of treaties. And not only that, there are different levels of the world. You have Dar al-Arb, which is the territory of peaceful arrangement, where you can pay a land tax and it's like protection. And then there are two other concepts which come up quite often, Dar al-Islam, which is the world of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, which is the world of war, in both cases relating to non-Muslims in various situations. Women have a very central role. Once again, kind of misunderstanding which one hears about in the modern world. Every now and again, I would hear people who were quite well informed speaking about, the importance of women in heaven as serving the men. It's a distortion. Women are highly respected. The four central women connected to the Prophet have a very, very high status. Because of their high status, and because Muhammad wanted to protect them, he ensured that their bodies would be covered. And that comes to this whole question of modesty. Where does modesty come from? Just to make one little small comment, at that time people were living in tents. And the family was living in sometimes situations in close proximity with the officers of the Muslim army. And therefore it was felt that there was always a tremendous danger of something happened between these young military men and one of the wives. And part of the modesty and the veil, different kinds of veils, come up every now and again in society, and it's not well understood where the idea comes from. The modest clothing, and I'm not taking a standpoint, but I'm trying to explain where it comes from Islam. The modern clothing is essentially, if we take the bottom line of the role of women, is essentially to protect women in a world, in a rough military, male-dominated world. I said it fairly simply, but I think that's maybe the best way of putting it forward. You see the book that I've suggested there, Muslim Women of Power, Gender, Politics and Culture in Islam, and the pictures I chose very carefully because it's important to not move into stereotype concepts. When we look at Iran, by the way, which we'll be talking about in our next session, that's when you have a very clear idea of what women are supposed to look like. But if you look at certain other countries, if you look at sort of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Qatar and places like that, you'll see even in that part of the Middle East, women are dressing in a very different way. Some cases in fairly modern clothing, although it's somewhat risky in certain cases. Where were the Jews? Big question, and just to try and take an overview on where the Jews are in. I think the best explanation is to say the following. Islam turned to the Jewish people. There were the tribes in Saudi Arabia at that time. And Islam turned to the Jewish people and said, look, we are prepared to take significant parts of your religion and recognize the importance of your prophet and present Ibrahim as the collective father of all our religions. But there's a certain condition that you have to become part of us. And I think some of the tensions that have developed come up from this basic concept. And the idea is we Muslims gave you a major opportunity. You're a small group, handful of people in Saudi Arabia, quite vulnerable. And we've given you that amazing opportunity to become part of us. And that's why in certain parts of the Quran, and certainly in the second chapter, you see it very much, and it comes up later in the Quran as well, very much the idea that we are here to protect you. However, the rejection by the tribes, and there are some comments which one reads about, there was a situation where the Prophet was talking to the wider population and the Jews were at the back and laughed. Once again, that term, mock, humiliate, show a lack of respect. And eventually what you begin to see is that from components of Islam and Judaism combining and working totally together, there's a counter thesis, which is very important, and that is to speak about the tension. And I think the summary that you see there of the Jewish Virtual Library is a good summary of what I think eventually it was about, that at a certain time, the Jewish tribes should be punished, and in one case, the third tribe, the people were killed. Let's move, because just a few more minutes before we come to your questions. And once again, please do look at my email and know that I'm happy to deal with any questions. We're now moving to the modern world, going forward hundreds and hundreds of years to the reality of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, we must remember, until more or less the period of the Second World War, was a very, very poor country, a tribal area filled with tensions between the various tribes. And from the Second World War onwards, when oil is found, it goes through tremendous change. So we have to understand Saudi Arabia in the pre-oil era. And what we have there is the tribal leaders led by a man who, Ibn Saud, who in 1932 combines the various kingdoms and tribes together. He felt that the only way to really become a local and maybe even a regional leader was to combine it with religion. And that's when he turned to the Wahhabi group. The Wahhabi group are sometimes called Caliphs. By the way, you'll find Salafists who do not like that connection and Wahhabi members who do not like it, but some sources certainly say you can connect the two. The Wahhabi group is a puritanical concept of the Sunni religion. Very, very strict, very much based on original sources, and very much against deviation and innovation. By the way, that the concept of being against innovation in certain Islamic societies is very important. We move forward, and the Wahhabi, as the religious group, move into totally different realms. Once again, as being a puritanical group, innovation, bid'ah, is what they don't want. Trying to be very, very strict, which leads, by the way, to a break-off group becoming ISIS, the Islamic State. So I think that's very important. If we're trying to understand where the Wahhabi led to, we can essentially see it in its most extreme stage as being the ISIS, Islamic State, which, by the way, it was a very, till today, because the ISIS still exists, a very, very problematic level where certain Sunni So until today, and we'll talk about it more next week, until today, look at the Shia, a break-off group, a group which comes about as a result of Ali, the fourth caliph, looks at them as heretics. So here you have within Islam, the two sections very much divided. By the way, not unique, divisions within Judaism we know about, and divisions we know about Christianity and other groups. So it's not a unique Islamic kind of phenomenon. The Saudi Arabian government has given what some people say, contested, $3 trillion to develop the Wahhabi religion through the madrasa, for example, through the colleges, which are very much rote learning structures. As I said earlier, tremendous amount of emphasis saying you have to know your sources by heart. Saudi Arabia in 1985 had about 190,000 students, a massive number in academic religious institutions, many of whom would travel around the world and certainly until today arrive in the United States. Tensions within Saudi Arabia. The Salafists are a divisive factor within Saudi life. And just to go back to your own experience of 9/11, and the question is, how could it possibly be that the Saudi government didn't know what was going on with the people who carried out that awful 9/11 event? The reason is that the religious factions have been in many cases allowed to do what they want. What the equivalent of the Minister of Religious Affairs in Saudi Arabia cannot directly, or in most cases, cannot directly control what's going on among the more radical groups. So you have the break-off groups, the small groups. It's partly true in the Sunni world, much more correct when we speak about the Shia groups, but it leads to tremendous tension, and you have ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and sometimes we'll use the term Salafist to try and explain the radicalization of Islam in the modern period, moving into very much a military kind of environment. What's the contemporary Saudi Arabia all about? Going through tremendous change. One never knows exactly how much change will be, because if you looked at certain members of certain kings in Saudi Arabia, initially it seemed as if they would be leaders of change, but it doesn't always happen. But there are interesting and important things happening in Saudi Arabia, not I presenting it as kind of the advantages of modernity. Many people listening to me, many Muslims listening to me would be horrified by what I'm saying when I speak about music, concerts, public events with both genders together, cinemas, all that kind of thing is very, very modern. Only the last few years do you see it. The force of change in Saudi Arabia today, and it's very important to watch this particular event, is the Mohammed bin Salman, who favors modernization, very much part of the Western world, but a tough customer, very, very tough, some people would say brutal kind of people, but trying to bring in modernity, I think very much aware of the new young generation. Let's remember, many young Saudis have traveled around the world, many, for example, studying at American universities, going back at a later stage to Saudi Arabia, horrified by the differences between America and Saudi Arabia, which you can imagine, and therefore bringing about this change. He is certainly very much in favor of tremendous change. And by the way, if you look at some of the YouTubes on Mecca, Mecca has gone through tremendous change. I remember looking at the Mecca YouTubes. I've never been there myself, obviously, but looking at the Mecca YouTubes many years ago and seeing it dominated by the Kaaba. And in the last 20 or 30 years, you see it's become a modern city surrounding the Kaaba. It dominates the holy of places. So towards the end, tensions in the Sunni camp, and just one term that I want to mention, besides the details that I've given there, is something which I think is maybe in a sense summarizes the Middle East, and not only Islam, but Middle East in a broader base. There are tensions on three levels, and we're talking the broad Middle East, between ethnicity, religion, and national identity. That's very important because when we look at next week, we're going to see that sometimes you can have a Shia coming from Iraq fighting in the 1980s with a person of the Shia group who lived in Iran. So the question is, in this complex Middle East that we live in, trying to come to terms with the fact that there are multiple identities, and one can be most committed to one's tribe or to one's religious group. Remember, we have to speak about Sunni and Shia almost as different religions, or loyalty to one's state. Just as you people will be able to get this recording later, if any of you are interested in a kind of a nice range of YouTube, fairly short ones on each occasion, I've put 5 on the screen, and you're welcome to look at them. And as I said, always welcome to email me as well. Thank you very much. Over to you and to your director, Matthew, for questions.
Hi, Professor Liptz. Thank you. The first question that I have here is, what are the prayers comprised of that are said 5 times a day? And so what is being
Sorry,
prayed?
what was the question? I didn't hear. Sorry, what is the...
Sorry, what are the prayers comprised of that are said 5 times a day? And
oh, they're prayers which mention Allah and Muhammad. So they're the same prayers that are said 5 times a day. So it's not a different liturgy, but a basic liturgy, which is always said. Okay, that's the basic concept. So you know the 5 prayers, and you say it same prayers at various times during the day.
And so what is being prayed for within the prayers?
You pray for, you see, when you pray for God and Muhammad, you're praying for a whole concept. So the people would actually, by praying for God, Allah and Muhammad, are at the same time actually praying for, let's put it in a simplistic way, for the 5 pillars. You're actually praying for the complexity of Islam in your prayers. Now, some people in certain parts of the world of Islam might be saying longer and adding prayers to it, because it comes from the first section, the first surah of the Quran. Some people actually might go for a slightly shortened version and just would actually know what the words themselves are. Just to mention something, I was once in a mosque in Istanbul, and I remember noting that everyone was together at one time, and then some people left and some people carried on. And so you can add together with your basic prayers a whole lot of additional prayers as well, depending on your sense of religiosity or even the time you've got during the day. So there is flexibility in terms of that.
Thank you. The next question, when and why did the concept of jihad move away from its meaning as spiritual struggle to war against the infidel?
I think it moved away and it's an important question. I'm not quite sure exactly at what particular stage, but I think it probably comes in naturally at a time when Islam moves out of Saudi Arabia under the Umayyads, which is the very large group which dominates many parts of North Africa and other areas, and at a later time the Abbasids, at a time of ongoing war. I imagine, and I'm not 100% exactly sure of the exact timing, but logic would say that that is really the time it becomes somehow confused with the 5 pillars. By the way, you will hear people, even some Muslims today, saying it is really jihad, and they speaking about sometimes the military jihad is actually the 6th pillar, but that is incorrect. But once again, without knowing the exact date, it's part of the period of the expansion of Islam over vast areas of the world. Remember, Islam got to the gates of Vienna under the Ottoman Empire. So the history of it is very, very militarily based.
So thank you. There's a couple of questions here about treaties with non-Muslims. So what, when you were speaking about treaties of non-Muslims, there was a little bit of lack of clarity about what that means. And there's also,
okay, good.
Okay,
So,
and also, oh, you want to, okay, you
sorry.
can go ahead.
So the world of Islam is essentially divided into three levels. A Muslim, by the way, just to say something very clear, it's very easy to become a Muslim. You say a few sentences and you're in, but you have to say it with meaning, with kavanah. So it's kind of, it's not just the words, but once again, when I say you have to say a prayer with meaning, it's a whole psychological concept, not only the actual words, but rather the concept that you're dealing with. So the Muslims, and therefore, by the way, a slave who takes on Islam is freed. So it's a very, very clearly defined top level. The second level are the people of the book, the Dhimma, the concept that the Jews and Christians had something which was very important. And the idea that Jews and Christians are people of the book is important because those concepts of Judaism and Christianity, the prophets in particular, but concepts, Jerusalem, the very fact that one of the second most important events in the prophet's life was not only going to Mecca and taking over Mecca, but was leaving from Jerusalem and going up to the heavens on a winged animal. Very important event. And why is Jerusalem taken? And why is Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem so important? Because these are the areas of the second level. And the third level are infidels. The infidels you don't have to relate to. They don't seem to have any particular level. Now, having said that, the reality is that in the tensions of the development of, and by the way, we must be honest, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 has been very, very problematic because according to Dar al-Harb, the world of war, and Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, non-Muslims should not actually be in control of Islamic territory. And Israel, Jerusalem, has taken over the territory of Islam. By the way, exactly the same happened with Spain. There was a terrible terror attack in Spain some years ago. And the question was, why are the Muslim terrorists attacking Spain? And the reason was, Spain, as we know, was part of the world of Islam. So the world of Islam on a theological level is very much the three stages. However, that isn't necessarily the world of dialogue, and one has to just differentiate. There is theology and there is reality. And sometimes as a result of that, even a very well-meaning Muslim religious leader, totally believing in the sources, would be happy to speak with a Jewish clergyman or a Christian clergyman on the same level. So we mustn't always assume that the defined theological framework is necessarily what goes on in the ongoing world relationship. I think that's important to say.
Thank you. I'll move on to a different subject here. What led to the murder of one of the Jewish tribes at the time of Muhammad, and what led to the very quick militarization of the religion?
Okay, the Jewish thing was really a rejection. You see it as you go through the Quran. There what might be perceived as being contradictory statements about the Jewish people. But I think the main issue is that the tribe that was eventually murdered, the Jewish tribe that was eventually murdered, was actually murdered because they had rejected Islam, but they had also rejected not only the possibility of becoming Muslims, but they had insulted Islam. They had insulted the concept that here you're being invited in and you had rejected them. The concept of humiliation, which I mentioned before, comes up again and again in the thousand year plus of Islamic history. And the tribe clearly had insulted and humiliated Islam, and not just didn't want to be part of it, they'd gone one step further. and they had acted essentially like an infidel. They had no status at that moment. So that seems to have been the reason. I'm giving the one answer, by the way. If anyone looks at a whole range of sources, you'll find other interpretations as well. You know, one has to, at a certain time, decide on which interpretation makes sense. And that's the one that makes sense to me.
Thank you. We have a good number of questions coming in and only a couple of minutes left. So I think this will be the last one, and then we can discuss the questions next week, or
email.
Yeah, or people can, everyone can email if you wanted specific ones. So here's one toward the top. Did Lawrence of Arabia have any significant I guess influence on the development or evolution of current Sunni Islam?
No. Lawrence of Arabia is, by the way, the movie, which got 7 Oscars, is a fabulous movie. It's actually, I used to use it in my teaching at Tel Aviv University to my Israeli students, because it has some very, very important components of tribal existence. But Lawrence of Arabia is much more important in the Western world, particularly in British society, than in Islamic society. So it's the movie and the kind of how it was presented, which I think is much more important than its actual relevance to Islam. It's one has to divide a Western movie from a theological reality, which is big divisions between the two. But it's a wonderful movie. If you haven't seen it, try and get hold of it.
Well, thank you, Professor Liptz. I think we'll I'll send you these other questions, and other in the audience can be in touch with. Your email address was on many of the slides, but we can also send it out in our reminder next week. So thank you again for this enlightening lecture. We look forward to learning with you next Monday at 10 a.m. in the continuation of this summer series. And I want to thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Have a good week.